right, so today we're going to be discussing is imperialism the cause of Africa's problems today? And let's look at some of the issues that Africa as a continent is facing after it manages to gain independence in the 1960s and 1970s, 1950s. So the first question is, what are the major problems that Africa is facing? So if we look at this little chart right here, we can kind of see they're going through per capita GNP, which is a gross national product, which is a measure of how much wealth a nation has, life expectancy, infant mortality, percent of people that are literate, birth rate per 1,000 people. So we see in North America now the number is low here for the GNP, which is the wealth divided up per person, because you have to consider Mexico as part of that number. But you'll see that the birth rate is 16 per 1,000. Average life expectancy 74. Infant mortality rate is 12 per 1,000 live births, and about 90% literacy. But when you look at Africa, you see that the numbers are much, much lower. Average life expectancy is 49 years old. Percent of literate people is 36%. So we can see just by looking at these numbers that there are some major issues that the continent is facing. And for those of you who took a PhD last year, you would know what one of these charts shows. So this chart shows age group differences in the developing countries versus the industrialized countries. So what we have is a very inflated younger population, whereas it becomes much smaller at the top, and that goes into the issue of low life expectancy, high birth rates, but then, like I said, not having a long life expectancy, whereas in industrial countries it's pretty even across the board. So one of the major issues that the continent faces, and a lot of the developing world, this is not just Africa, but also South America, parts of Asia, there are huge differences between the rich and the poor. So the economies in a lot of these nations are still dependent upon export of one single crop or one single natural resource. They don't have diversified economies. They don't have industry. So you have a population that is expanding very rapidly, a very high doubling rate and a high birth rate. However, there are not jobs to provide, there's not enough jobs to provide for this population that's growing so fast. And they don't have the technology needed to meet the necessities of life for this growing population. So what you have is a large group of people living in poverty, a very small group of people living in extreme amounts of wealth, and really not a large developed middle class. In addition, if we look here in regards to health statistics, this graphic is showing here. It says every year around 2.5 million people in the rich world die from heart disease and illnesses associated with obesity. So the problem in the developing world is we're dying from eating too much, and in the developing world it's the complete opposite. So what this is showing is the average intake of calories. So every day about 40,000 children die from malnutrition, and so this is countries with the lowest amount of caloric intake. So if we look here, countries like Mozambique, which is in Africa, Ethiopia, which is in Africa, Somalia, which is in Africa, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Chad, Kenya, the Central African Republic are some of the areas that the people intake the lowest amount of calories. Whereas you look at a country like Greece, Ireland, the US, we take in almost, in some instances, more than double the amount of food in calories that these people are having every day. Another issue is there's not a strong infrastructure across many of the countries in Africa. So cities are not like what we think of. So this here is an image of the Congo River. So the Congo River carries hundreds of passengers on its 1,000-mile journey through the Congo because it's safer to travel along the Congo River rather than to try to travel on roads that really basically are inadequate or in most instances don't exist at all. So we also see this on the Niger River in West Africa. So we see it on the Congo in Central Africa, we see it in the Niger River in West Africa. Think about the Anthony Bourdain episode on the Congo I showed you, and you could think about how undeveloped and how any infrastructure that was there, that was built during the colonial times, has just since decayed since something like the railroads and how the trains weren't operating. So many of the people in these areas live in very simple homes, what we would consider basically a shack or a hut. So very, very simple, dirt floors. Basically it just provides shelter from the rain. Doesn't really provide any other comforts that we would think of home. And here you could see women along the riverside washing their laundry because they don't have running water and they don't have access to washing machines, so they have to scrub it and wash it in the nearby river. Another major issue that these countries face is that they don't have enough water. So these are countries that are experiencing water stress. So you can see most of these countries do tend to be in Africa, especially North Africa and the Middle East. But so clean water is another major issue. And you can see what some of these houses look like. Most of these buildings are simple cinder block or mud brick with a sheet metal roof. You can see there's another simple home. So basically, Africa's population is expanding very rapidly, and as a result of that rapid expansion, it's a doubling rate that's very fast. It doubles in about the next 25 years. But the problem is, because the geography is so fragile, the environment is so fragile as far as like the savannas and the grasslands, not having really good areas for agriculture, we have a decline in food production. So therefore they have to import food. And that puts even greater stress on the country, which makes not that much money itself, having to then import food in order to be able to feed the people. So where the conditions become really bad in the countryside, the issue then is that people then begin moving into the cities looking for a job, looking for a better life. And so if we look at this picture here, we can see the percentages of Africa's population and how it's been going up, and the trend towards 2030. And then on the flip side, the percentages of those people now moving into the cities. So we see that it's a steady incline as far as urbanization. So the issue with these cities, with these mass migrations to the cities that are occurring, is the cities aren't industrialized. So there's very few jobs. And because there's so many people looking for jobs, pretty much wages are kept really, really low. These large groups of urban poor, it's very easy for them then to be manipulated into different rebel groups. And because there is not adequate jobs or housing, what we see is many of these people live in slums, in squatter settlements that are on the outskirts of the city. So what you have is the core of the city, which might look very modern and developed, and then on the outskirts you have these huge squatter settlements where people just build shelters with whatever trash they could find, wherever there's space. With no running water, no electricity, no sewer system, no policing, nothing. So it's kind of almost like a lawless area. So a lot of these cities in the developing world are called parasitic cities, because essentially they're like a parasite. They suck resources from the land. They don't really give much in return to the land, because they depend on the countryside and don't really provide much to the economy. So we see here, this is what some of these squatter settlements look like. So basically whatever materials they can find to build some sort of shelter is what they use. And you could see these are some of the cities in Africa, but you could see again some of the squatter settlements on the rings. Like, I know when I was in Nairobi in Kenya, you could see off the side of the road these huge areas that would just look like it went on for miles of just these makeshift houses. And then even the nicer houses all had water tanks because they didn't have running water. So they would collect the rainwater, and that's how they would have running water for the house. So another issue is that many of the resources that these countries do have, because a lot of these countries have a great deal of resources, is that it is controlled by foreigners. So basically they rely on the sale of cash crops and minerals to try to fund some hope of industrialization. What we see is a lot of these countries are locked in what we talk about this with Latin America, a neo-colonial relationship, a new colonial relationship, because they're still in that position of exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods. So if you look at this graphic here, 64% of their imports are manufactured goods because they're not producing any of these things themselves. And so basically the money that's spent on those manufactured goods sometimes it's more to the benefit of the wealthy rather than the benefit of the poor. And being dependent really on just one particular crop really makes your economy very vulnerable. So if there's a market slump, the economy can be completely trashed. And when times are good, the government then tries to make investments in the country. For instance, if the price of a particular crop, say for instance in Zambia, if the 90% of their exports are copper, so say the price for copper on the world market's gone up, they're going to start all these building projects and trying to kind of make their country better. But then what winds up happening is if the price of copper falls, then their whole economy is trashed, and now they can't finish funding these building projects, and then they have to borrow money, and then this puts them into a cycle of debt. And so it really makes it very difficult to establish some sort of stable government in these countries because the economy is so fragile. So if you look here, for instance, in Sudan, 65% of their exports are cotton. In Somalia, 71% is livestock. Senegal, 37% is ground nuts. Nigeria, 89% is oil. Malawi, 55% tobacco. Ethiopia, 69% coffee. Ghana, 61% cocoa. And then in Zambia, 90% copper. So what happens is, since they're not earning enough money, they then cover what they need by borrowing, and they pay back really, really high interest, which then further just drains the country. And this creates a spiral where, if you could see from 1970 to 1982, the amount of money that these countries have been borrowing has increased dramatically. And as far as Africa goes, its share of the world GDP. GDP is gross domestic product, so it's the measure of how much a country earns. So if we look here, the United States, European Union has a huge share of the GDP. Latin America has a relatively small GDP. So basically, Africa would fit into the other developing economies, and it's about 8% of the world's GDP. In the end, this makes it very difficult to establish a stable government. So between 1957 and 1982, more than 70 leaders on the continent of Africa were overthrown by violence. So now one person in particular I want to talk about, this man here is Kwame Nkrumah. He, if you remember from when we were talking in class about African independence, he led Ghana's independence movement. He was someone who was committed to social reform. He was committed to improving the economy. He did tend to have, in the context of the Cold War, what we would call leftist leanings. So he was gaining some of his support from the USSR, and that alienated the US. So we really weren't willing to help Ghana because they were kind of getting help from the USSR. So we weren't really giving them any aid. He tried to move Ghana towards industry because he really wanted to end foreign dependence in Ghana. Now, the way to do that, he used cocoa to fund industrialization. I remember 61% of Ghana's exports were cocoa. The problem was that, again, the price of cocoa fell, and it fell sharply, and then he didn't have the money to be able to continue these industrialization projects. So then rival political parties began to challenge his ideas and block his efforts. And as a result, he became more and more dictatorial in response to this. And he began to ban rival parties, he began to jail leaders, and Ghana went from one of the richest countries in West Africa to one of the poorest countries. In 1955, there was a gold miner strike because they wanted to, they were striking for better wages and better working conditions. Nkrumah responded to that with the Trade Union Act, which made strikes illegal. Basically, he also suspected plots from opposition members in the parliament, so he passed the Preventative Detention Act, which allowed him to arrest and detain anyone charged with treason without involving the courts. In 1961, the railroad workers went on strike, and he ordered all the strike and opposition leaders to be arrested. And so basically, he became, like I said, as he had these good intentions, he wanted to try to do things to help his country, but as he became more and more frustrated with his efforts at not being able to get these things done because of a lack of money, he became more and more dictatorial as time came on. So basically, advisors close to him were so afraid of him, they were afraid to discuss problems because they feared that they would be arrested. Clinics across the country actually completely ran out of pharmaceuticals, and no one told him because everyone was afraid of what was going to happen if they were the ones to tell him. He began to also fear assassination attempts, so he declared a one-party state, and he made himself president for life in 1964. And then, excuse me, in 1966, he was actually overthrown. So this is kind of the classic example. He had good intentions, wanted to help his country, became frustrated with the inability to do so, and became more of a dictator. And so you can kind of see some of the instability, why there's such instability, as an older picture of him, why there's such instability within the country, within these countries. Now, also thinking about the Congo, remember we talked about the Congo earlier in class in regards to what should happen to the Congo in regards to the Belgian rule. So the Congo wound up being under the leadership of this man, Mobutu Sese Seko. Remember, he had that crazy long name, like, I am the warrior that will leave fire in my wake. He was supported by the U.S. because he was standing up against the USSR. He changes the name of the country to Zaire. But basically what he did is he bled the country dry. When he left power, was like a millionaire, a billionaire, but the Congo was in a complete mess. That's why the New York Times said he left a house that had been eaten by termites. And the Congo, which has huge amounts of natural resources and had, a huge infrastructure left to them by the Belgians, really could have done something, but because of these government leaders who are more concerned with enriching themselves and not enriching their country, the country kind of fell apart. So today in the Congo still we have a civil war going on. It's one of the longest running civil wars. About 5,000 people are fleeing. There's displaced persons, refugees, because of the area being controlled by rebels. So if you remember that Anthony Bourdain, there were certain areas they couldn't go to because certain areas were controlled by all these various different rebel groups. Now, why does everyone are interested in the Congo? Again, it has huge amounts of natural resources, gold, diamonds, copper, and that is rubber, and that has commonly made it an object of exploitation. And what we also see in many of these countries that are kind of being ripped apart by civil war is that children are being pulled in and used as soldiers. So we see this in the Congo, we see this in Uganda, we see this in many other countries. Unfortunately, here we can see this is a child rebel in the Congo. It seems so strange to see a little kid with a gun on his back. Angola is the last country to gain its independence from the Portuguese in 1975, but Angola also is in a huge civil war in which child soldiers are being used. And here you can see this little kid going to school, walking past these completely bullet-ridden buildings. So this high rate of population growth that I was talking about earlier is another major issue that kind of just trickles down into the country. It basically creates pressure on an area that already is under great stress. So that's a major problem. Famine is a major problem in Africa. So that's kind of like places like Nigeria, other Ethiopia, Somalia are places that have undergone long-term famines. Meanwhile, you have by the mid-21st century, Nigeria is going to have a population equal to China. And so some of the reasons for that is a resistance to birth control. In many of these countries, procreation, or having many children, is a sign of male virility. Sons in particular are very important. And sons are also not only important to the status of a man, but also to the status of a woman, so she could build up lineage. And so there's a pressure to have as many children as possible, but because the health care is so poor, there's a very high infant mortality rate. So a woman might have between 15 and 16 pregnancies, and 10 to 12 of those children will not live to pass their 5th birthday. And because these are rural farming communities, and there's no system in place to care for the elderly, children are important to help work on the farms, and children are important to take care of parents in their old age. And these attitudes are very deeply ingrained in the culture in many of these countries, and that's why the large families persist. In addition, it is very common for women to get married very young. Anywhere in the developing world, because I also saw this in places like Nicaragua, the girls will get married 15, 16 years old. So that means that that's extending the life, their childbearing years. You know, women here in the U.S. don't start getting married until their, you know, late 20s, early 30s. They don't start having children now until their 30s. So they're shrinking the years that they're available to actually have children. They're having less children. We see the opposite happening across these countries in Africa. And so because they get married so young, there's very little opportunity for them to obtain things like a secondary education or a higher education or a career. In addition, there is a widespread growth of HIV and AIDS. So, I think I skipped it there. But there's a widespread of HIV and AIDS. Basically, 1/3 of the population of sub-Saharan Africa has AIDS. And that also goes into this resistance to birth control, lack of education, and raised knowledge of how diseases like AIDS spread. We also see famine, like I said before, is a major issue, partly because of desertification. So we have issues of overgrazing of the fields, where fields go from this to this, because there's too many animals grazing, and then the land just, all the grass gets eaten up and it just gets dried away, it just begins to erode away. Now, the other major issue, which we kind of talked about in class previously when we talked about the Scramble for Africa, is of course that these borders are not drawn in any way reflecting the tribal ethnic boundaries of the people. That's one of the reasons why we see so many civil wars breaking out in Africa, and that's why we've seen a lot of ethnic violence in places like Uganda, in places like Rwanda and Burundi and the Sudan. So there's just a huge list of countries that are torn apart by either religious violence or tribal violence, because these borders that these people are now stuck with really don't reflect what the borders should have been of the continent. Which gets to this problem of, can these problems actually be fixed? So basically, basically these countries need to try to figure out a way to create some sort of stable government and work with the issues that they have, and not continue to fight with each other within their countries, but that's easier said than done. So just to show you kind of a little bit of what parts of Africa look like today. This is in Arusha in Tanzania. This clock marks the midway point between Cairo and Cape Town. This is an airport in Tanzania, in Zanzibar, which is the island off the coast of Tanzania. So basically you just walk right up to the plane on the tarmac. Here you can see this is a Masai herder herding his goats along the side of the road. Here you can see this is what some of the shops and stores look like. Even the stores are built, it's all like very simple cement block, not very well built construction. Here you can see, this is in Kenya, what some of the streets look like alongside the roads in Kenya. You can see it's dirt roads. This is also Kenya. This is Tanzania, so this is a marketplace, so the women are selling all their goods in the market in the morning. This is also Tanzania. That's Moshi in Tanzania, so you see the kids going to school. And then you can see this is some of the roads, some of the conditions that you see in the roads in these areas. So there really is no proper infrastructure, which makes any type of economic development very difficult. These are Maasai. The Masai are still nomadic and usually goat herders, and they were showing me how they can make fire. And then these are some of the Maasai children. So I want you to think about, is imperialism the cause of Africa's problems today? Like, does this all go back to the way that they were treated and the way that they were colonized by the Europeans back in the 19th century?